Okay, good morning, everyone. Again, we're on Masechet Yoma, Daf Yud Omid Aleph, 10a, towards the bottom. We're about 10 lines from the bottom. That's where we're due to start from. And the Gemara will now begin a very different theme than the one we've been dealing with in the last few weeks, or indeed since the beginning of the Masechta. The Masechta is meant to be about the separation period of the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur and some of the functions of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, but it diverted into a large tract of Agadah dealing with the Kohanim Gadolim over the various periods of Beit Rishon and Beit Sheni. And then it went on to talk about the destructions of Beit Rishon and Beit Sheni. It compared the merits of the two sets of generations, the generation of Beit Rishon and Beit Sheni. And over the last week or two, we had a rather strange Gemara talking more about the end of days, the end of Beit Sheni, if you like. And we dealt with the two world empires that would survive, according to the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, till the Mashiach's time. And which two would they be? The ones that would go, so to speak, to the final wire would be the what the Gemara called Edom and Prus, which for us means the Western world, if you like, Rome originally, but the Western world and Iran, perhaps in a modern vernacular. The Gemara wanted to bring proofs either way. And it was unresolved whether eventually the Western world would bring about the destruction of Iran, or whether Iran might actually bring about the destruction of the Western world. Well, in the words of the Gemara, whether Edom will defeat Prus or whether Prus will defeat Edom. And the Gemara brought proofs, and it was unresolved. And of course, we're towards that period now, and so perhaps we have a better idea than Chazal did, as to how the future will pan out. If indeed we assume that Edom and Prus can really be equated with today's Western world, as, if you like, the flag bearers of the Roman Empire, and whether in fact Prus can be identified with modern Iran. It might be the Middle East in general, or it may be that we're misinterpreting those proofs completely. But the Gemara rests its case there on the Agadah, on the historical storytelling. And as always, when we get into Agadah, there isn't really a firm conclusion. We discuss concepts, we discuss ideas, we discuss opinions. But none of us are prophets, and therefore we can't see how the future will pan out, even with the help of Chazal. So we're going to carry the Gemara forward from roughly 10 lines from the bottom of Yud Amud Aleph, a few words from the end of that line. Towards the end of the line, you have Tov Reish, it has an abbreviation, the third to last word, and then Kol Halishkos. Tolu Rabbonon, our rabbis taught, Kol Halishkos. Now, we're going to be discussing a little bit about the structure of the Beis HaMikdash, although not in great detail now, because the discussion is going to really center around the halacha of mezuzah. But let's just take the brisa forward and see how we actually leap into the halachas of mezuzah. And it will turn out that the shtickle of Gemara that we'll be dealing with, quite a long shtickle of Gemara, which gets a little bit complicated, is one of the major sources for Hilchot Mezuzah. So when you asked, what does Yoma have? Well, apart from Agadah and Yom Kippur, it has a great big chunk on Mezuzah as well. So let's enter this brisa. Tonu Rabbon, and our rabbis taught, Kol halishkos shehoyu b'mikdash lo hoyu lehen mezuzah chutz milishkas parahedrin. All the chambers in the Beis HaMikdash, all the rooms in the Azara and in the Ezras Noshim, all those chambers, which we will have a look at in a moment, lo hayu lahen mezuzah, none of those chambers actually had a mezuzah on the door leading into those chambers. Chutz milishkas parahedrin, apart from one chamber, and that was the lishkas parahedrin, and the lishkas parahedrin was that chamber in which the Kohen Gadol was cosseted during the 7 days of preparation. That was the only chamber in the Beis Hamikdash that bore a mezuzah into its entrance. We'll talk a little bit about why for a moment. Well, let's just do the next few words, perhaps in the brisa before we look at those chambers. Shehayu bo beis dira leKohen Gadol, because during those 7 days of separation, that the Kohen Gadol was a lodger, and he stayed there day and night during those 7 days. And for that reason, the Lishkas Parahedrin carried a mezuzah because it needed to, because it was a beis dira. It was like the home of a Kohen Gadol, maybe not long term, but even short term. Since it was his home during that period, it carried a mezuzah. Whereas the other chambers, it seems, were not really homes at all. They were used for storing things. People came in and out. But the Lishkas Parahedrin was more of a house-like structure because it was the place that Kohen Gadol was, functioned, ate and slept, etc. during that 7-day period. Let's carry on. Rabbi Yehuda is going to essentially disagree with this first opinion. We would say this first opinion is the Chachamim, but this opinion now is Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says specifically, not quite the same as the first opinion. V'halo kama lishkos hayu b'mikdash shahayu lohen beis dira, says Rabbi Yehuda. That's not entirely accurate, because there were many chambers in the Beis Hamikdash, not just the Lishkas Parahedrin, in which you could say there were beis dira. We'll see why in a moment. People were spending time in them, and therefore they should also have had a mezuzah. What's special about the Lishkas Parahedrin, just because the Kohen Gadol was there for a week? But there were other chambers which were also used as temporary lodging, the lo hoya lahem mezuzah, and there was no mezuzah on those chambers either. We'll have to see why not, if they were places of lodging. But he agrees that the Lishkas Parahedrin was the only one that did carry a mezuzah. And so he says, Ela Lishkas Parahedrin Gezerah. The only reason the Lishkas Parahedrin was treated differently from those other chambers, in that the Lishkas Parahedrin, where the Kohen Gadol was, carried a mezuzah and the others didn't, wasn't because one was more of a home than the other, but because the Chachamim made a particular Gezerah, which we will look at later on, a particular enactment to require a mezuzah for the Lishkas Parahedrin. The Gemara will say later on, at the moment it'll sound very bizarre, that the Lishkas Parahedrin was where the Kohen Gadol was forced to be during that 7 days. Because in fact he had no option. He was like a prisoner, you might say, in the Lishkas Parahedrin. You know, no one asked him to be Kohen Gadol, but now he's Kohen Gadol. He can't say, I want to stay in a 5-star hotel during those 7 nights. I'd like to isolate somewhere in a lodge outside Yerushalayim. He has to be in the Lishkas Parahedrin. So the Lishkas Parahedrin, the Gemara will say later on, took on, if you like, the impression, at least in front of other people, of being a bit of a prison. And according to this opinion, now a prison doesn't need, as we'll see later on, according to one opinion anyway, a mezuzah. Even if you spend a life imprisonment somewhere and you have your own cell, according to this opinion, you don't need a mezuzah. I bet you never knew that. Just excuse me, my phone's going. Robbie, I'm giving a share at the moment. So I'll speak to you now. I'm giving a share at the moment. Can I phone you back? So it did give the impression of being a prison cell. And as a prison cell, it would not require a mezuzah. But the Chazal didn't want people to feel that the Lishkas Parahedrin was a prison, even though in a sense it had a likeness to being a prison for the Kohen Gadol. So they said, we we'll put a mezuzah on there just so that people understand that it's not a prison, of Her Majesty's prison service, but it's actually a religious place, and therefore they ask for the mezuzah we put in there really to counter the impression that it is a prison of the Kohen Gadol, even though it bears some characteristics of being a prison. That's what the Gemara will say later on. Anyway, let me not go, and some of those aspects will be dealt with a little bit more fully later on. But at this point, we have what seems to be a bit of a machloket between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. Chachamim said there were many chambers that all had, the Chachamim said that the Lishkas Parahedrin was a place where the Kohen Gadol was resident, and that's why there was a mezuzah. But other chambers, the Kohanim were not resident in the same way, so they didn't need a mezuzah. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, they were all places of residence, but there's this peculiar reason why the Lishkas Parahedrin was marked out to requiring a mezuzah. We just share the screen a moment. We'll dip in and out of these halachot of mezuzah. We want to try to get too deeply into it, but I just wanted to share with you, this is one of those plans. Let's move my strip of video away. This is quite a detailed one. I'll expand it even more. I really need some parts of the picture. Anyway, here's the Heichal again. Second. Here's the Ezras Noshim. And you can see, just to give you an example, you can see all the lishkot here, the chambers. Lishkat, this is called the Lishkat HaNazirim, where the Nazirim used to, where various things were done for the Nazirim before they had their hair cut and their korban. Lishkas HaEitzim, where the wood was stored. Lishkas HaMitzoraim, to do with Mitzoraim. Lishkas HaShmonim, where the oils were stored. Over here, you have the Lishkas HaGozis, where the Sanhedrin was resident. The Sanhedrin was over here. They had their actual chamber here at the edge of the actual Azara of the Beis HaMikdash. Here's the Mizbeach, as you can see. And here you have the Lishkas Parahedrin is this little thing over here. That little thing over here is where the Kohen Gadol was. But as you look round, you can see the Lishkos everywhere. They dot. All these are chambers. All these are rooms of sorts. Stop sharing here. So there were many chambers in the Beis HaMikdash, and this is Rabbi Yehuda's comment that they were all of them like the Lishkas Parahedrin, places where people sometimes stayed. And Rabbi Yehuda would say that, even though it's true that the Kohen Gadol spent 7 days in the Lishkas Parahedrin, some of these other chambers were used as night rooms for the people who were guarding the Beis HaMikdash. They had their sort of guard houses. So there were chambers here and there, and they would all equally be Beis Dira. But the only one that had a mezuzah for this peculiar purpose of marking it out not to be a prison was Lishkas Parahedrin. Okay, now the Gemara goes on. Let's catch it again on the page. The Gemara says, my timer to Rabbi Yehuda. What is the reason that Rabbi Yehuda says that Rabbi Yehuda said here that the Lishkas Parahedrin doesn't need a mezuzah min haTorah? It was just this peculiar reason. Even though it's a form of Beis Dira, it doesn't deny that. It doesn't need a mezuzah min haTorah. It was only an enactment, so it doesn't look like a prison to other people who are seeing it, that they put a mezuzah on. In other words, it was a cosmetic thing. But why shouldn't it need a mezuzah? If it is a Beis Dira, why shouldn't it need a mezuzah simply because it was a Beis Dira and not have to come to this subsidiary reason of putting the mezuzah up for cosmetic reasons? There's a fundamental Torah reason. If it's a Beis Dira, it says in the Torah of the Sabtam mezuzahs Beisecha or Bisharecha. Well, if it's a bias, it's a Beis Dira. Doesn't it need a mezuzah per se for Torah reasons? So here we start trying to get to the bottom of what needs a mezuzah and what doesn't need a mezuzah. So Amar, it should be Amar Rabbah, Kosova Rebbe Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that kol shebayis base she'enu osuya, or kol bayis she'enu osuy limos hachama v'limos hagishomim. Now, this is not necessarily something we hold off. Let's just take the Gemara at the attempted answers that come forward now. Any home or house or place of residence which is not used as a home during both the summer and the winter, eino bias, is not considered to be formally a house that needs a mezuzah. We're not so much talking here about summer and winter. We're extrapolating this to any place which is only used seasonally or occasionally. So even it may be a house or maybe a palace, it may have colonnades in front of it. We're not talking just about huts. But if it's only a temporary abode and it's not used during the rest of the year, a person only comes into it for a season at a time, then it's not going to need a mezuzah. It's not considered to be choshev. In other words, the Gemara is suggesting, whether or not this is accepted in halacha is irrelevant at the moment, that when the Torah says, it's only referring to bais kavua, a house which is fixed to be your home. Now you might ask, what does fixed mean? If you go away for 2 weeks for a summer holiday, does that mean that all of a sudden your house doesn't need a mezuzah the rest of the year? I don't think that's the intention over here. Let's remember, we're talking about places like the Lishkas Parahedrin, which is only used for 7 days in the year for any form of lodging. So it's far more of extremely part-time dwelling. And for that reason, Rabbi Yehuda says it wouldn't need a mezuzah. And you're probably thinking about, what about sukkah and sukkot? We'll get on to the sukkah and sukkot, because it's a very similar situation. Maybe we should start arguing that a sukkah needs a mezuzah for at least the 7 days of Sukkot, and there's a good reason to believe it should. So let's put that aside for the moment. The Lishkas Parahedrin is somewhat of a parallel, as we'll see later on. You use only 7 days a year, just like Sukkot, with your Sukkah, which is built just for Sukkot. And according to this opinion, it does not need fundamentally a mezuzah. The mezuzah was on the Lishkas Parahedrin, says Rabbi Yehuda, only because of this strange thing that it shouldn't look, that you might think, well, it doesn't have a mezuzah because it's like a prison cell or whatever. So they put a mezuzah up to make it look as though this is a good place where the Kohen Gadol has freedom of movement. It's not a place he's being incarcerated and handcuffed to a chair or whatever it is. So, but formally it doesn't need a mezuzah because it is not a full-time form of housing. The Brisa uses the expression, or the Gemara uses, kol bayis she'eino osui limos hachama v'limos hakshamim. Limos hachama during the sunny days, limos hakshamim the rainy days. That means summer and winter. Now the Gemara asks a kasha against this. How can you say that a home that isn't used both in the summer or the winter doesn't need a mezuzah, and for that reason the Lishkas Parahedrin doesn't formally need a mezuzah? That doesn't make sense at all, because we have a posuk in Amos. I'm sure you're all thinking about this posuk in Amos. I'll share it with you in a moment. It's cute. The Gemara is going to try and come to a conclusion from a posuk that has obviously nothing to do with mezuzah. So let's see what this drasha is. The Gemara says that the posuk says, "V'hikesi beis choref al beis hakayetz." I will smite the summer house along with the winter house. I'll just share the posuk with you. It's not really necessary to see it on the screen, but I will share it with you. Let me contract this page.
I can't hear.
Here we are. So it says in Amos, "V'hikesi beis choref al beis kayetz, v'ovdu bote hashen v'sofu botim rabim nur Hashem." This, unfortunately, is an edict made against Klal Yisrael because of their averus, and how their wealthy living style will be brought to an end. So Amos says, "I will wreck the winter palace, beis hachoref." That means a winter home. It doesn't mean a winter palace. Al beis hakayetz, together with a summer home. For Ovdu Bote Hashem, the ivory palaces shall be demolished. Hashem, tooth, this is ivory, if you like the tooth of an elephant. The ivory houses will be destroyed. The Sofu Botim Rabbim, and the great houses shall be destroyed, declares God. So here Amos is railing against particularly the wealthy classes of Klal Yisrael, that have slaves, don't let them go, don't provide sustenance to the widows, to the orphans and to the needy, and they have plenty of cash going. So eventually they'll see both their summer houses and their winter houses. So if you've got a summer house somewhere in Boca Raton and a winter house in Jerusalem, or vice versa, you'd be knocking over both of them. And this is how they will meet their punishment. So what's the proof here whether a summer house or a winter house needs a mezuzah? Where does the word mezuzah appear in that passage? Not at all. But the Gemara's argument is this. The Gemara's argument, Eisevei Abai V'Hoksiv, this pasuk, as base ha'chorif, as base hakayetz. And the Gemara is alluding to the fact that since the summer home and the winter home are both given the name of bias, they're both phrased and defined as being houses, then they, according to the Torah at least, there's a presumption they should need a mezuzah. What does the Torah say? V'chasavtam al mezuzos beisecha ubishorecha. In other words, if you have something which is a bias, then you need to put a mezuzah on. Well, the pasuk in Amos says that a winter house is a bias, it's a beis choref, and a summer house is a bias, it's a beis hakayetz. So, hey presto, doesn't that mean that they require mezuzot? Yeah, if that is the parameter that defines whether you need a mezuzah, if something is formally termed a bias, well, the pasuk in Amos is called them bias. So that's what the Gemara wants to suggest. And if that's the case, that Lishkas Palhedrin as well should have needed a mezuzah formally. Forget about any other absurd reasons that the Chazal may have conjured up. They should have needed it because it is a bias. It has a temporary home. If a summer home and a winter home are called bias, and it's not a question so much whether it's summer or winter or whether it's 3 months or 6 months, you could actually make a difference between this case of the summer and the winter home and the Lishkas Palhedrin. I do agree, but the Gemara is suggesting, that it's not a question of how long is the string or how short is the string. You see that a house that isn't populated the full time of the year is still referred to as house, and therefore Lishkas Palhedrin should also have required a mezuzah min haTorah from first principles. That's the Gemara's question over here. How is it Rabbi Yehuda says it doesn't require it? You only stick one on because we don't want to make it look like a prison. So therefore the Gemara answers, and the Gemara's answer is a little bit bitty over here, in that it is going to make a chiluk, a differential in terminology. So Amalei, so Rabbi answered Abai, your kasha from Amos, bringing me this pasuk where you say the summer house is referred to as bias and a winter house is referred to as bias. That's true, but the pasuk in Amos actually uses a descriptive term for each of these batim, which specifies them, and it's this descriptive term, beis choref or beis kayetz ikri, beis stama lo ikri. It's really playing with very fine distinction in terms. A summer house is called a beis kayetz, says Rabbah. I agree, and a winter house is called beis choref, but neither of these is called bias. In other words, if you have a winter home, interesting idea. If you have, let's say you have your summer home in Boca Raton, whatever. What Rabbi is saying is, it is called your summer home, but it's not called your home. And if you have your winter home in Jerusalem, it's your winter home, but it's not your home. If you use the title bias without describing what type of bias, then it means a place you're in all year round. Only if you have one place you're in all year round is it your bias. Otherwise, it's a bias of type A and it's a bias of type B, but it's not a stum bias. It's not a straightforward bias. And when does the Torah require a mezuzah? And this is supposed to be the answer. When it says "Uchosabtom al mezuzos beisecha uvishorecha," and it doesn't say base chamon, base gishomim. It has to be something that is called a bias stum. It has to be something called your home, without any further temporal description. The Torah only means you to affix a mezuzah to something which can be called your bias, and not one that needs bias hyphen choref, bias hyphen kayetz. Seems a little bit of an uncomfortable answer, but that's the way the Gemara is getting away from the need to put a mezuzah. For Rabbi Yehuda, when he says that Ishkas Palhedrin does not need a mezuzah formally, except for this other strange reason, Rabbonon, he's saying so because it's only a temporary abode, and even though it may be a bias l'shivas yomim, it doesn't have the title bias, which would formally bring it under the requirement of saftam al mezuzos beisecha or visharecha. Right? We're splitting hairs over here, but that's the way the Gemara is answering for Rabbi Yehuda. You don't need formally a mezuzah on this Lishkas Palhedrin because it's not a bias. It's a bias l'shivas yomim, if you want, but not a bias stam. Okay. Now the Gemara is going to question this even further from another Mishnah, which is a bit more technical. But the Mishnah is going to show, or seem to show, that such a place, which is only a bias for a short period, is called a bias. Don't tell me that it's not called a bias just because it doesn't have it's saying bias this and bias that. The Gemara is challenging this last answer that a bias chorif is not really a bias and a bias kite is not really a bias, and the Palhedrin, Lishkas Palhedrin, is not really a bias because it's only short-term tenancy. The Gemara is going to prove that that is not the case, and it's going to prove it's not the case from the more obvious 7-day habitation place, your local sukkah. So let's have a look and see how this is a proof. Does a sukkah need a mezuzah? So let's have a look. And if a sukkah does need a mezuzah, then even though it's only used for 7 days, it proves that a short-term tenancy also is considered a bias. So let's see how this. But the Gemara brings a Mishnah which is a little bit more technical. Doesn't just deal with mezuzah. It deals with other aspects of a sukkah and what a sukkah does and doesn't lead to halachically in terms of trumas and maestras and other things as well. Let's start this Mishnah. Abaye asked the kasha against Rabba, who just given this distinction that if something is bias korov, it's not a bias. If it's not, it has to be a full-time bias to be a bias. From this Mishnah in Maestros, Sukkahs Hechog, the sukkah which has been built for the festival. So you've built a sukkah, not necessarily your garden shed, which is there the whole year round, but you built a sukkah for the festival. Bechog, during the festival. And now we're talking about what is going to be the situation of a sukkah you've built and you are now in Cholamod sukkahs, for example. Not you built the sukkah and you haven't taken it down, it's 3 days after sukkahs, but during sukkahs itself. What is the status of the sukkah? So Rabbi Yehuda, now we are looking for Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, want to know why Rabbi Yehuda says he didn't require, the Lishkas Palhedrin didn't require a formal mezuzah. What does Rabbi Yehuda say?
Hello? Aaron, I'm having a problem.
Right, sorry, and a mute. The Sukkah Sachag, let's just read the words of the Mishnah first and then explain what they're all about. Mechayev. Well, if you were learning Hilchas Maestras in Mishnah Maestras, you'd know what does it oblige. The Sukkah does oblige, but the Chachamim potrin. But the Chachamim disagree and says the Sukkah does not oblige. So we're talking here about a special technical requirement in Hilchas Trumas and Maestras. So you've got a field, and you are you're reaping the field. You're taking in your crop. At what point does your crop require Trumas and Maestras to be taken? Is it from the moment you actually scythe the wheat, that you already have to give truma to the Kohen. I don't mean from that point onwards necessarily, but I mean, is there any obligation? Let's say you were reaping your field, and then you decided you wanted to eat something from what you're picking up. You want to chew a grain or something like that. Can you? Or do we say, no, don't touch it. You haven't taken Truvas and Maasros yet. You're not allowed to have anything out. It's Tevel until you've taken Truvas and Maasros. You can't. Or can you? Has it reached a point where halachically the mitzvahs of Trumas and Maasros have kicked in?
Unmute is right. Let's unmute.
But it says I have to press Alt plus A.
I'm not sure. I seem to be okay. At what point does this Trumas and Maasros kick in? So the halacha normally is there is a point at which Trumas and Maasros kick in. Before that point, there is no din of Trumas and Maasros, and if you're walking right, you can munch, you can give your dog a bit, you can chew. If you're a worker, you can eat a sandwich and stick a few grains from your crop in the field, and it's not considered to be tevel. It hasn't yet reached that threshold. What's the threshold? When the crop is taken into your barn. And depending upon what the type of crop is, it might require you to smooth the top of the pile first. There's a certain point in which you say, now snap your fingers. It is subject to Trumas and Maasros. I'm not allowed to eat anything until I've given my Trumas and Maasros. Before that point in time, you can. It's called Ad Sheroa Pnei Habayis, until the crop has seen the face of the house. The face of the house usually means not your home and your bedroom, but rather the barn. So that is the point which is mechayiv, Ad Sheroa Pnei Habayis. So here's the question that the Mishnah in Maasros is dealing with. It's quite interesting. Suppose you want to you're chopping off your grain, and you want to bring it in, but instead of bringing it into your house, it's Sukkot Cholamoed, and you decided that, I'll just take it into the Sukkah. I move it into the Sukkah. Is that a trigger point? Do we say, in other words, that the Sukkah is like a bias? That the Sukkah is like taking it into the barn? It's considered to be a bias definition. And therefore, from that moment it lands on the floor of the sukkah, it's chayiv and trumas and maasros, and you mustn't touch. Or do we say that the sukkah, it's as if it doesn't exist, it's as if you just put it down on the floor of the ground outside? It hasn't seen that. It hasn't seen something which can be defined as a roeh panei habayis. Is it a bias or not? Is the sukkah a bias? And what should be the question? Well, the sukkah is only here for 7 days. So it's the same situation with a different halachic consequence. Does it mean that now you've taken the crop in, you need instantaneously to give trumas and maasros, or does the act of taking to sukkah actually, is it really that irrelevant to the roeh pnei habayis? It's only until you take it from the sukkah into your barn that it'll ultimately need to have trumas and maasros taken from it. So Rabbi Yehuda says chayiv. The moment it goes into the sukkah, it's chayiv, even though it's only short term. From which it seems to mean that the sukkah, even though it's only part time, is considered to be a bias. It's like, hey, but didn't we just finish saying that for Rabbi Yehuda, something which is only temporary is not considered a bias, doesn't need a mezuzah? So in which case, why should it suddenly provide the threshold for needing to take trumas and maasros? It shouldn't require the threshold. It shouldn't meet that threshold at all, according to him, if it's a temporary house. It's the Chachamim who potrim. The Chachamim take the view that you don't need a trumas and maasros to be taken yet. It hasn't reached that threshold. You could sit in the sukkah and chew from the pile. But Rabbi Yehuda is the one we're talking about. Rabbi Yehuda is the one we offered this answer that something which is not a full-time bias is not considered to be a bias or mezuzah. It also therefore should not be a bias which would obligate you to take trumas and maasros, and yet the Mishnah shows Rabbi Yehuda holds that it does obligate you. So this is a question against the position we just took a few moments ago. And the Gemara goes on, the Tani'ala, in fact, there's a brisa that was brought in Maestris to expand on this original Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Mechayev, not only does Rabbi Yehuda be Mechayev a sukkah, as meaning that it reaches a threshold for taking trumas as maestris, as we've just seen in the Mishnah. That was in the Mishnah, that you take your crop into the sukkah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it means you're chayav trumas and maestris. But Rabbi Yehuda said some other things about a sukkah as well, which in some ways are simpler. He said he was mechayev, says the Brisa, be'eruv chatzeros. We just talked about some of these things before, where you have more than one home opening into a courtyard, which is jointly used by the members of that courtyard. So it's not a public thoroughfare. It's like having the grounds behind a block of apartments, which are closed off to the street, but are used by members of the apartments. Normally, everyone living in any of the homes or the apartments of that block need to participate in an Erev Chatzeros if they're going to carry in that joint garden on a Shabbat. And that's a halacha midrabanan, that you have to make an Erev, what's this Erev Chatzeros, a particular ritual, so that you can create a jointly owned Rishus HaYochid. Whereas, and otherwise, you wouldn't be allowed to carry. Now that's a din for all the homes that open up into that courtyard, that they need to all participate. If one home doesn't participate, then you can't even make the Erev, and the others can't carry there either. So you all need to get together and pay your 50 cents and buy a box of matzahs jointly, or whatever it is, in order to make that Erev. It's a simple procedure, but it has to be done. And Rabbi Yehuda said that if you have a sukkah, and someone's living in that sukkah, let's say he doesn't even have a home in that block, but he's put his sukkah there, and then on a Shabbat, he has to be one of those people participating in the Erev. He can't say, well, I've only got a sukkah. I'm not really like a homeowner in this block. I'm only a sukkah owner, and a sukkah isn't a bias. So we say to him, no, I'm Rabbi Yehuda. I'm holding that even though you may only be here 7 days a year, you are considered to be a bias holder. And therefore, you need to pay your dues and join in the Erev. Another raya, another piece of evidence that a sukkah is taken fairly formally as being a home. And furthermore, that was Erev, and ubimzuzah, and now we see the case of mezuzah, beforish explicitly, and he says that while you're in the that if you have the sukkah, you also need, during the period you're there, to at least put up a mezuzah, and maybe further more than just a period of a year. But you can see that he holds explicitly this time, without needing to look for parallels, that a sukkah, place you only stay in for a week a year, needs a mezuzah. And we've just said before that we were explaining Rabbi Yehuda in relation to Lishkas Palhedrin, the Kohen Godel's 7-day apartment a year, which is a direct parallel, it would seem, to that of Sukkah, that he wouldn't require there, he doesn't require there a formal mezuzah. There's only a mezuzah put up for some absurd reason, but that doesn't require a formal mezuzah. But you see very clearly in this Mishnah that Rabbi Yehuda does require a formal mezuzah, even though you only do 7 days a year. He doesn't say that doesn't make it a bias. It has to be a bias, mole, full time. Doesn't say so at all. We have a sukkah which is 7 days a year. If he requires a mezuzah there, he should also require formally min haTorah a mezuzah in the Lishkas Palhedrin. That should be required from first principles. Nothing to do with some prison look-like or whatever reason we give later on. Now the Gemara, so this is a kasher against our understanding, Rabbi Yehuda, that the reason he doesn't require a mezuzah on Lishkas Palhedrin is because it's only temporary. Here you see that even for a sukkah, which is temporary, does require a mezuzah. So the Gemara, first of all, brings a chachit tema, means it wants to defend Rabbi Yehuda a little bit and say, well, you might want to answer on behalf of Rabbi Yehuda in a certain way, but if you did, it wouldn't work anyway. So the Gemara now is going to give what might have been your defense of Rabbi Yehuda, and then it's going to brush it off. So let's see what the defense might be. Chachit tema, Should you wish to say that what Rabbi Yehuda was saying before in this Mishnah, that you need an Erev and you need to put up a mezuzah and it's mechayiv b'maisrus as soon as the grain enters into the sukkah, you might say midrabanon. You might say no, maybe there Rabbi Yehuda was only talking about a rabbinic need, a chumrah, that you should put a mezuzah up, you should take maisrus from what and trumas from anything that's brought in. You need to put an erev, but min haTorah, it's not a bias, and therefore you could defend him in the case of Palhedrin, saying there's no formal min haTorah reason, and in this Mishnah that we just brought with Sukkah, it is all rabbinical. And we don't say every situation needs a rabbinical chumrah, but over here they made a rabbinical chumrah. That's how you might want to defend it. That this is only rabbinical in this Mishnah here. Says the Gemara, no. If you start saying this is rabbinical, this will lead you to a technical problem. We'll have to look what the technical problem is in a moment. It cannot be that Rabbi Yehuda's requirement for taking trumas and maisrus, when you bring the grain in for the erev and for the mezuzah, is all because of a chumrah drabonon, a rabbinical edict that doesn't have Torah standing. Can't be. Why not? Because the Gemara says, Bishlama eruv umezuzah, I would be prepared to accept, says the Gemara, that you might want to make a chumrah, and Rabbi Yehuda may have required a chumrah in the case of eruv and mezuzah, if those were the only two cases that Rabbi Yehuda was strict on. I might say, what is a mezuzah? I go to a hasofer up the road in Shai, so I'll put a mezuzah on. I'll put it on without a bracha, big deal. And when it comes to an erev, what's an erev? An erev means that I'm going to put, everyone's putting in 10 cents and buying a box of matzahs. Even if I don't need an erev, Rabbanon, they said you might as well do it. I'm prepared to live with that. But I'm not prepared to live, says the Gemara, with Maisa, the Rabbanon, with the need to start taking trumas and maisras when you bring them into the sukkah, that rabbinically they would require that. I cannot believe they would do that. We'll see why in a moment. It has to be that if Rabbi Yehuda held that you have to take trumas and maisras as soon as you bring them into the sukkah, that he has a Torah reason for it. And that leads again with a problem with the Lishkas Palhedrin. You cannot say that was Drabonim, and you have to say it's min haTorah, and therefore probably all these requirements are min haTorah, the mezuzah, the erev, and the taking in of the grain for maisras. How do I know maisa could not be a rabbinical enactment? So they just said, bring it into the sukkah, but you don't really need to take trumas and maisras, but you might as well. We're saying that from this moment onwards, you should take trumas and maisras. How do I know that cannot be the case? How do I know it has to be min haTorah? And here the Gemara brings a principle that brings in other places, although Tosfos asks a big kasharot in this case. And a maisa mi'ikal meimah drabonon. Can you possibly say it's drabonon? And we move over to Yud Amud Beis 10b. This is a statement that's made sometimes as a problem with chumras, particularly in trumas and maisras, but not everywhere, but it's said in some places. There's halacha that if you have a need to take, shall we say, truma from a pile of fruit, let's say, or figs, or whatever it is that you haven't taken truma from yet. So up to now it's tevel, which means you can't do anything until you have taken truma from it. Well, let's say you've got another pile of figs from which you haven't had truma or maisras taken. You don't actually have to take your truma and maisras from each pile individually, as long as you take the required quantity from the two piles together. So you've got two piles, both which need, shall we say, maisa taken. It's a simpler calculation, which is a tenth. So you need to take a tenth. One pile has got 100, figs in it. The other one has got 300 figs in it. What you could do is you'd say 300 and 100 is 400. 10% of 400 is 40. You can decide how you want to take that 40. You can take it 20 from one pile, 20 from another pile, or very simply, and this is more often the case, if one pile is more accessible than the other, take all 40 from that one pile. When you take then when you take the Maisa from the pile that you're taking it from, you have in mind that it should be Maisa, not just for that pile itself, because what you're taking is excessive for that pile, but also for the other pile, which is 100 yards further down and you can't be bothered to get to it. That works. That works very well. That's called taking Maisa from one pile onto another pile. But what you're not allowed to do is take Maisa from something which doesn't really need Maisa, min HaTorah, on behalf of a pile that does. So let's go back to our two piles again. Suppose I have two piles. One pile needs Maisa taken, and the other pile doesn't need Maisa taken from it. Maybe you've already taken Maisa, right? Whatever reason, doesn't need Maisa. You've got your two piles. So you say, okay, one's 300, one's 4. So you know that, let's say for a moment. So you know that you definitely need Maisa to be taken from the pile which needs Maisa, and that's got 100 in. So therefore you need to take 10, but you can't reach that one. So what you say is, I can't be bothered to walk to the pile that needs Maisa taken. I'm going to go to this pile over here, which is next to me, which doesn't need Maisa taken. But who cares? Do you think the Levi's going to complain? I'm going to give him even better apples or figs from this pile. Let me just calculate what I need, 10. I'll take 10 out of this pile, and I'll have in mind on the pile which really needs. Not allowed. You can only take if them both from one pile on another if they both require it. But to take it from a pile that does not need Maisa and to have in mind on another pile that does need Maisa is totally ineffective. It's like not giving Maisa. It's like giving, toy railways or something. It's just not the same currency. It has to be from something that needs Maisa. You've got to give from like to like, from like on behalf of like. So now what's the problem? The problem would be this. If it were true, says the Gemara, that the Maisa that Rabbi Yehuda requires you to take as soon as you bring your grain into the sukkah, or whatever it is not min HaTorah, but rabbinic, then it might lead to you making a mistake. Because let's say you don't even know what's rabbinic, what isn't. Rabbi Yehuda says take it, and he says it's only rabbinic. We know it's only rabbinic because we're doing the Gemara, but he doesn't know it's only rabbinic. All he knows is he has to take Maisa from it. And he's got another pile somewhere else where the Torah requires Maisa to be taken from. It's actually in his barn. So he might, and it's so common that you take from one pile onto all the piles because it's a terrible bother if you've got 20 piles to go and take from each pile separately. So what you would do if Rabbi Yehuda really only made this as a Gzeira Drabonon, you could end up with a disaster called by this Chumrah would lead to a Kula, because you might end up taking, say, what have I got? Another pile in my barn, which really needs Maisa, and that's 300, so I need 30, and you've got one in your sukkah, which is 100, and you don't know it doesn't really need it in Torah. So you say 300, 100 is 400, I need to take 40, so you'll take 40 from the pile in the sukkah, which doesn't really need Maisa taken at all, which means that the pile in the barn, which really needs Maisa taken, has had no takana at all. It's as if you're not allowed to eat that in the barn, but you don't know. Right? You've taken it, you're going to end up then later going onto your barn and thinking you've had Maisa taken from it properly, which you took from the sukkah, but that was illegal currency, if you like. And it didn't work for the pile inside. Seems a bit twisted, but essentially the Gemara makes these arguments in a few places, and it actually works on a certain principle that sometimes if you make a chumrah, if you were to say Rabbanon, really Rabbi Yehuda doesn't need Maisa taken, but he said let's do it Rabbanon in the sukkah if the food comes in, that would be a chumrah. But that chumrah, if it can lead to what the Gemara often calls a Technicolor, which means it can be an obstacle to doing things correctly, you may not be aware, and there's even the potential that a mistake and harm can come from a chumrah. You wouldn't do a chumrah. And therefore, since Rabbi Yehuda says that you do take Maisa when it enters the sukkah, says the Gemara, doesn't that prove that it must have required Maisa min HaTorah? Since he wouldn't have made this chumrah rabbinically, because that might have led to this case where you might take Maisa from it on behalf of something else. It might not, but it might. Since he wouldn't, and he wouldn't have done such a thing because he's aware of not leaving obstacles. It's almost, stumbling block in front of the blind. Not everybody knows what is rabbinically required, what is Torah required. He wouldn't have made, therefore, a drabonon requirement to take Maisa. And therefore it must have been Minal Torah, which means that all the statements made by Rabbi Yehuda about a sukkah are probably all Minal Torah. In other words, it needs an Erev Minal Torah, it needs a mezuzah Minal Torah, and we're back to square one. If it really needs a mezuzah Minal Torah, and this is only a 7-day-a-year place, a sukkah, then why doesn't the Lishkas Bal Hedron also need a sukkah Minal Torah? If it's also a 7 days a year thing. And we said for Rabbi Yehuda that it doesn't really require a mezuzah Minal Torah. It's just because of this thing. It might look like a prison, so we put one on, cosmetic. I don't understand it. Rabbi Yehuda, just proven from here, Rabbi Yehuda holds that a temporary residence is considered to be a bias for all other purposes, so therefore it should need a mezuzah, even Minal Torah. Okay, I'm going to leave it over here because the Gemara is going to go through some more contortions as we do this. The Gemara itself is quite interesting, but it is quite complicated. And we will be seeing later on, when we go to the next piece, that a chiluk is going to be made, a distinction is going to be made between the Lishkas Pal Hedron and the Sukkah. You see, that will get us out of trouble, because at the moment, we're asking a question: if a sukkah is this, a Lishkas Pal Hedron, where the Kohen and Gadol was ensconced, should be the same. But are they really the same? No one challenged me on this. They are both 7 day a week, 7 day a year places, but they're not necessarily the same. If you remember, just to give you a clue on this, those of you who were with me from the beginning on Masechet Sukkah will already know that there was the Masechta opens up with a very famous question, whether a sukkah is a dirat arai or dirat keva. Is a sukkah considered to be, or does it need to be formally, halachically, what you might consider to be a temporary dwelling or permanent dwelling? And it doesn't mean there how long you spend in there. The terminology is very misleading. The Gemara says there that that certain aspects of a sukkah have to be such that you can define your sukkah as being diras arai, according to the Man D'Amo, says it needs to be a diras arai. And if it doesn't have those characteristics, it's not a kosher sukkah. And according to another opinion, it needs to be a diras keva. And so there you can already see a difference. The Lishkas Pal Hedron is nothing like that. There is no din in the Lishkas Pal Hedron whether you formally needs to be called keva or arai. And this is going to leave a distinction in mezuzah as well. Because if you say that a sukkah is only a diras arai, that it should have the definition of being a temporary place, then that, and not a permanent place, that weakens it as a place needing a mezuzah, compared to the Lishkas Pal Hedron, which, even though that's only also 7 days a year, but it doesn't have a formal definition of being a diras arai. Yeah, okay, here we're talking a bit about terminology. We'll leave that for next time, and that will be the distinction between the Lishkas Pal Hedron and Sukkah, which we've been equating so far. So I'm going to quit recording.